Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. And I'm welcoming you to a special show today. It is ordinarily the time I air my Dissident Dispatch show. However, this week I had an opportunity to speak with someone who represents a generation we talk about a lot, but we rarely hear from directly, and that's Generation Z. Unfortunately, often when people of my generation, Gen X, or even to a certain extent millennials, are talking about Gen Z, it's in a pejorative way or a concerned way. And as I said, we don't often get to hear from Gen Z directly, except for, let's say, extreme voices you might see in the streets, protesting or standing up in class and, making a spectacle or going on TikTok. And you might wonder, what about the majority of the students? Because those students certainly don't represent anything like a majority of Gen Z. What about others? What about those who are not out in the streets protesting? What about those who might be caught in some other place? Well, I'm pleased to say I have somebody here to talk to us about that. And while I'm sure she would say she doesn't speak for everyone or even a large group, I think it is fair to say that it is important for us to listen to what she has to say, because it is my personal opinion as an educator and a parent that she does represent a large enough sample size of students that we need to listen to what she has to say. And because if we really care about improving education for all of our students, all of our children, we need to hear the voices that are not heard from. With all that said, I would like to also ask you to please consider subscribing to the channel. If you appreciate work like this and you want to be notified when I make more videos, that's the way to go. Check your subscription if you've already subscribed to make sure it's still in effect. I've heard from people that sometimes accidentally gets unsubscribed. Wonder why that happens. Also, like and share this broadcast so other people can benefit from what we're about to cover. And let me tell you a little bit about my Gen Z guest, Margo Margen. Not her real name, but I hope you can understand why somebody of her generation would not want to use their real name, which in and of itself is sad. Is a writer and board game designer, most prominently working as a columnist and member group leader at Third Factor magazine. After feeling isolated in her high school's strict progressive culture, Margo took it upon herself to be a voice for others in similar circumstances. In particular, she hopes to help Gen Z students. So I know there are probably a lot of parents listening. Please, I hope you consider sharing this with your Gen Z child struggling in these harsh environments. Her mission is to make sure other students don't have to suffer and prevent their anger from spiraling into harming those with whom they disagree. Margo leads a member group at Third Factor called Maladjusted to Maladjustment for those who don't fit in with being different. And we're going to talk about what that means. She has also published 2 original games, the board game Cross Cards, I think it's CROX Cards, and the icebreaker game Socializer. So I'm so excited, and I really actually feel privileged to use a word appropriately for a change, to have her trust to bring you this story. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Margo Margen. Hello, how are you today?
Hello, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure. As I said, it's a privilege, really, because it takes a lot on your part, I think, to even just put your face out there, right? There are adults that I invite to come on the show who don't want to come. So what you're doing is quite brave. I hope it's all right if we jump right into defining some terms that I used in your bio that are used in our title here. We talk about what it's like when you don't fit in with being different. So if you could explain what you mean by different, being different, and then even after that, what would fitting in be?
Yeah, sure. It's very interesting in today's culture that my generation has now. Different has almost become the norm, but they still call it what has always been called different. People who are unique, quirky, think outside the box, artists, the dyed hair, just trying to seem as weird to older traditions as possible, and different, of course, also being all of your minority labels and breaking out of the boxes of those, such as myself as a woman and myself as a woman who isn't wearing pretty dresses and makeup. That's what is considered different. And fitting in would be going along, raising your hands. I want to be different. It's something that's expected that everyone wants and needs. And, why would anyone want to not be different?
That's so interesting. How I am curious about how the norms from which they want to differ or against which they measure different are communicated. So let's go by order. Like thinking back to elementary school, if you can go that far, how did you become aware of what these alleged norms were? How did you become aware of them at young ages? Let's say, 6 to 10 or 11.
Well, in elementary school, I was at a fairly ideologically neutral school. And so I wasn't seeing any of the norms I was taught that there apparently were. I actually never felt any pressures that would be described as sexism or gender expectations, or the feeling that I was any less than for any aspects of who I was. It wasn't until I got to my high school where I was pushed and told that I was a victim of a lot of different social pressures of how this nebulous society expected me to act. And I think that's why it became so confusing, because I never had that internalized feeling of these norms, so I wasn't sure where they were coming from.
That's fascinating. So you made it through elementary school and middle school just feeling like you were you and life was life. And
Yeah.
did you have the perception that it was okay to be all different kinds of people? Like there wasn't a norm per se?
For the most part, yes. Within my peer group, when I was really young, I was misdiagnosed with a mental health diagnosis that I have come to realize is completely false. And so I was around a lot of people who were very different and told that I was very different and an outsider. But that was sort of an edge case. But otherwise, adults never made me feel bad for being some kind of different, whether it was having unique interests or being a girl, or whether I would end up realizing I was gay or bi or something. It wasn't super stigmatized as a lot of people in my school expected to be. There were also very devoutly religious people and all different viewpoints. The key example is, I remember in seventh grade, we were told not to say, "Oh my God," out of respect for the Christians in the class. But we were also asked not to say, "Oh, that's so gay," out of respect for the gay people in the class. It was always just an acceptance of treat people with respect. And it hadn't become so rigidly locked in that there was only one answer and one solution and one viewpoint yet.
Interesting. So in your case, you felt like it really began in high school. Now I'm going to ask you to speculate about something, and so it's outside of your experience, but I'm curious your point of view. Having had that experience, since if I were to tell you, I now observe as a researcher that the norms or the alleged norms are now being communicated more and more to those younger age kids. So they're not waiting until high school. They're starting to do it at younger
Mhm.
ages, like in elementary school. What are your pronouns and things of that nature? And women are oppressed and Black people are oppressed. With the like, there was a book written specifically for elementary school kids called
Mhm.
It's a Bad Idea, to be white. Given what you went through, can you sort of speculate what it might be like for even a 6-year-old to suddenly be presented with, there are these norms, and, you know, if you fall outside the norms, then what might that be like? You said you felt confusion as a high school kid. What do you think it would be like for a 6-year-old
I think
or 10-year-old?
for someone that young, uh, like 6-year-olds in the early grades, when you're getting fed this stuff and it's all that you know, it's a lot harder to question it. There might still be those internalized feelings of I'm less than, or I must be oppressed, or wait, I'm the victim, but then also I feel like I'm being told I'm the bad guy or put in power. But at that age, that's more complex to grasp. So at that point, I think the real danger is, since that's all a kid knows, like similar to someone who only knows a very strict conservative religious structure, they might not be able to see other perspectives. Once you get to the older grades, I think even someone as young as 10 can still feel the shock of, but I never felt like I was the victim, or wait, I'm now suddenly the bad guy. It's incredibly confusing, but it also gives a lot of incentive for kids to say, well, now this is right. And I think some of them, especially once you get to the middle grades, almost want to cling to this because at that age, you hate school. You don't want to do your homework. You don't want to listen to your parents. And you get something in your lap that says, now you can call it societal abuse. Why would you not latch onto it? And there's almost no discipline to bring people up to have the maturity of why those things actually matter. Instead, it's encouraging these kids to explode.
Interesting. So at any point in time in your educational experience, were you asked to respond to these lessons, implications, whatever you would call it? So you say it really began in high school. It didn't begin in middle school. You didn't really have any of this stuff in middle school. So really, okay. So at that time, maybe just tell us about how the norms were introduced, in what context, and then what what was the framing of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I started in 8th grade and then all throughout high school at a school that really believed in these progressive ideologies that we talk about. And it was pretty clear the way they taught this. In something like, for instance, in English class, we'd have a book talking about a person of color's experience with racism. We'd get TED Talks shown to us. This is what's racist. This is what you shouldn't say. And then all of the questions on that book would be about what's wrong in society. I remember also in history class, I think a shining example is we were shown Donald Trump's State of the Union address, and every few seconds the teacher would pause it and say, okay, this is what he really means. And it was always dissecting every line to mean something like, he said freedom of religion, but actually he means that he's supporting the Christian religion and he wants to force Christianity on all of America. We were just taught this through the lessons, and we had several hours a week of community service. We had community events every Friday where we'd watch documentaries and break down all of these topics. And it felt, this is a problem you need to wake up about. You need to realize that this is bad. It's hurting people. If you say a bad word, well, then it influences bad ideas. And then it's making a bad society. That's the end of the world. They wanted us to be critically engaged citizens. And by that, I really feel like they meant they wanted us to all become protesters.
That's so interesting. So when you were in these classes and they would say things in this declarative way, this is what he really means, or this is bad. Did they present it as the whole world agrees with us and that's we're passing along this knowledge to you? Or did they present it as we have special knowledge, we being the teachers or we being the people at the school have special knowledge to give you, and anybody and or everybody in the outside is wrong?
Oh, they presented it as we're the only ones that believe this, and out there, society has taught you this, and they're wrong. They thought that everyone was suffering and needed to be woken up from the norms that they were taught. We would have open discussions, but they would quickly be moderated by the teacher to just have students who agreed with the ideology break apart anything that didn't, in the same way that the teacher disassembled the president's words. And that was always really confusing for me, because the society that they seemed to pin the blame on, I had never personally experienced. And it was as if I think a lot of them were in that school community traumatized by the norms that they spoke about. And they were still seeing themselves as perpetually in that victim mode. And so they would come in under the assumption that their actions wouldn't have an impact. It was just fighting back. But it felt as if they were unaware of how their society and their school was making me feel. And the only norms I would feel was a set of rules that they listed that the outside world believed, which, speaking to people now, I've realized most of the things that they've said about how other people think aren't actually true.
Wow. Now, did you have opportunities to specifically challenge them on any of these? Do you recall any times where you um ventured forth and said, I don't feel this or I disagree?
I never spoke up about how I felt. I was always too scared to, because I had this feeling of walking on eggshells. Like, if I object, then I'm doing something bad. I'm being a sexist, homophobic, racist, whatever, and that's contributing to all of this horrible discrimination that they would show us. Footage from any type of riot, you name it, we've definitely seen that. And so I almost played the act of going along with it for those, especially the later years.
Interesting. So, as you did that, as you played the act, went along with it, at some point, did it become real or did it become, meaning, did you become attached to those views in a way that made it harder and harder to question them even in your own mind? Or did you always know it was an act?
I deep down always felt like this isn't me. But more and more, I started to think, this isn't me because there's something wrong with me. I remember one of our lunch clubs was made for women only, even though it was just an art club that had no reason to be women only. And I felt really angry being there because I couldn't understand why it would be made that way, except to protect me when I didn't need protecting. But I was sitting there thinking, I'm the only one that feels this way. I'm a broken woman. And I felt that for a very, very long time, until I decided to do, which it felt like, I was stepping in to join the league of villains when I joined a group that wasn't fully into the social justice stuff. And then I spoke to other women there and found out that I am not actually broken for feeling as though I don't need a women's group for everything that I do.
That is so interesting. So, but you did speak to other women to find that out. So you asked them, "Do you feel this? Do you feel that?" And they were honest with you?
That was after I graduated, when I first
Oh,
joined Third Factor.
got you.
I asked, and I asked it with a lot of shame. I still felt like what I would say would be seen as evil or rebellious or a little bit crazy. And it really showed me how much my high school kept me in a bubble where I wasn't able to see any perspectives other than theirs.
Wow. Now this might sound really far-fetched, but I'm going to ask anyway. You describe the feeling of, not relating at all to the notion that, you're a woman, therefore you're oppressed and men are, misogynistic because that hadn't been your experience. Do you think it's possible? Again, I'm calling for speculation here. Do you think it's possible that young women in a high school level situation who feel similarly decide they are broken women, ergo they are not women at all? In
Um,
other words, fueling sort of the I'm non-binary and or maybe I'm really a man because
I
I don't feel oppressed.
I'm not certain if that would apply to someone like me, because I feel like when you're on the edge and set to the edge, you assume that you feel that way because you're privileged, and so therefore you cannot possibly be anything other than a cis straight person, because if you were a minority, you wouldn't be questioning this. I have,
So
sorry.
so then you just no, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but so then maybe instead you just felt irredeemably like bad.
Yes, and bad being all of the things that would be considered the social majority. I have stories about being asked about gender identity or uh, orientation, if you would want me to get into that here.
Well, only if you want to. The reason I asked is that I've wondered how you talk about maladjustment. And one of the things I've learned as a parent of 3 girls, I mean 3 children period, but let's just say 3
Mm,
girls because we're talking about the experience of women being told you're oppressed, is that even in the same household, even from the same parents, 3 individuals can feel differently about the scenario that you're describing.
mm,
So in other words,
absolutely.
somebody communicating a message like women are oppressed, and one might say, I don't feel that, and just be like, "Pfft, you're wrong, and move on. Another one might take it in and say, I don't feel that. What's wrong with my feeler? Like what's wrong with me? Am I terminally privileged? Am I not going to be able to be a good person? Sort of some of what you're describing your reaction was. Like what's missing that I can't get there? I can't wake up, so to speak.
Mm,
And then a third one might have yet another reaction, namely, um, I don't feel that. And if that's what it is to be female, is to feel oppressed. If like they go together so intrinsically that it can't be separated, that my sex and my feelings of oppression can't be separated. Maybe I'm not this sex at all. And I'm not saying that has anything to do with my literal children. I'm just telling you that knowing that 3 individuals can have 3 individual reactions, I'm throwing that out there for the audience to appreciate the fact that we tend to take a one-size-fits-all approach
mm,
to education in general, but especially when it comes to things like social and emotional learning and how people pick up on messages. And it's important to remember that Margo here is an individual. At the end of the day, you're an individual person. What you're telling us is really important,
mm,
in my opinion, most notably because it explodes the notion that you can just say, we'll teach them all empathy and it will be all better. Or we'll
mm,
teach them all this and they'll all feel. We have really no idea. So we should probably be very careful how we convey messages about how one does feel or should feel.
mm. Absolutely, and I appreciate you bringing that up. At times, I never wanted to specifically be called a woman in a sense like, oh, you're the female contributor to this, or a women owned business. Not that I would fight people over it. And people have asked, well, does that mean you're non binary? Because there's an expectation to deeply identify with female as if it defines your personality. And I could definitely see others um, taking up something like non binary because of that, too.
Interesting. Yeah, that's the main reason I brought it up is that, going back to when I was a kid, I was a tomboy, what we used to call a tomboy. And even now, I can recall feeling strong identification with the tomboy label because I did not feel girly is what we used to call it. I didn't feel, feminine. We didn't have the word feminine when you're like in, 5th grade, 6th grade. It was, girly or whatever. And so people call you tomboy. And I clung to that. That
Yes.
explained it, and it gave me something new to be and throw everything into it, cut my hair short, wore boys' clothes, like the whole 9 yards, because it was too painful to feel like I well, if that's what a girl is this other stuff. Interest in Teen Beat, Tiger Beat magazine, like teen heartthrob boys and all that, whatever, and gossip and putting sun in my hair or whatever. That if that wasn't appealing, then maybe I should go over here. We didn't have all these other options that kids have now, but it's it's very confusing. So, would you say that today the norm of being different is still fairly restrictive in the sense that the ways it's okay to be a girl or a boy or a man or a woman, whatever you want to call it, are still prescribed?
Uh, I would say yes, but almost in the sense that they are reverse prescribed. To give an example, I remember the first time I was recommended women's colleges, I was explained how it's so much of a relief to not have to worry about things like, does my hair look okay? And what am I wearing today? And that felt almost humiliating to me because it felt like I was being told I was oppressed for wanting to brush my hair and look nice when I'm in a professional setting, which I think that can be someone's authentic desire, even if they wouldn't, I wouldn't always wear this suit jacket that I'm wearing right now over to any old friendly get together, but I think I still want to make a good impression on people that I'm working with, where I would need to appear more formal. There was an expectation, though, that that's just me being indoctrinated, and the real heart inside of me would never do that. But I'm not suffering because I brushed my hair today.
Well, that also presupposes you have no agency.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that there's no authentic way to want to look good. It almost sounds like they're denying that you would have an individual want, period, that all of your wants are socially constructed. So then I have to ask, did they have any self-awareness that they were replacing the social constructs that were allegedly oppressing you with new social constructs that could oppress you anew?
Uh, very little. No, I see a lot of the pattern that happens in people like this. They feel like they're perpetually on the defensive and walking on eggshells. And that feeling, I think, started with people who were actually in a traumatic situation of really strictly oppressive social norms and took needed actions to stand up against those. But it's since never stopped, and it's been projected onto all of the students. And now you have students that feel like everything they say is just, I'm defending myself against society, the world, the other out there. And they don't consider themselves a society or a norm. And that's almost really heartbreaking to me, that they feel like they're always just these people living on the edge who are never truly empowered or accepted, because we do need a culture that can accept everyone for their differences. And there are some people that fit in with norms like that. But in their case, they always felt like they were just constantly in protest and never what everyone was being taught, which was also extremely confusing.
So that makes me curious how people in your experience amongst your generation thought about friendship, thought about just forming social connection voluntary social connection, was that even a thing? Or are all connections around these defensive postures and
It
positions?
was strange because there were two very extreme versions of social interaction you would encounter. There would either be a focus so much on be yourself, love yourself, that it would rarely be seen as someone needing someone else and wanting to join in a community activity, even if you, as your authentic self, wouldn't necessarily, go watch that movie, but my friends are watching it. That was looked at as, oh, you're tearing yourself down. And when I would have lunch conversations, it was usually people ranting about social topics and not hanging out having fun. Most of the clubs at my school were just race group and gender group. But then you'd also get a very eggshell walking culture where everyone had to be comfortable and everyone had to be accommodated. And we couldn't ever judge anybody or be remotely selective with who we wanted to be friends with or who we liked, unless that person was a bigot. And that would cause a lot of fake kindness where you were never really connected with anyone, but everyone was trying to be nice. And it felt like we were all holding hands in a circle, but then we all started running different directions, and then the circle would just collapse.
That sounds like lonely to
It
me.
was.
It also sounds exhausting.
Mhm.
So if I think about times, for example, at work, where the environment was heavily, there was a lot of office politics of who likes who and who's, who doesn't respect so and so and who's looking for a promotion. There's all this kind of stuff, even amongst adults. And whenever I've found myself in environments where I had to emotionally work very hard at not offending people or not, how I say what I say, above and beyond politeness, above and beyond just common decency and respect, it just amplified the normal stress of a job,
Mm-hmm.
so much so that it became unbearable. What was that like? Was it like that? Was it like you just felt tired and confused all the time? Or
Yeah.
were there moments of light? I don't know.
Yeah. I remember in school walking through the hallways, we had just done some work on racism, and I was thinking, because they talk about microaggressions and how even just tensing up near someone is enough to be racist, and therefore, like, that person's going to have a mental health crisis if they see you doing that. And I would walk down the hallways feeling the eggshells, like I'm going to look at somebody wrong. And a lot of fake smiling, a lot of burying your real opinions so deep that you could never say, oh, I think that Jacob is really annoying. I don't know anyone named Jacob. But uh, at the same time, common decency and politeness, like brushing your hair or wearing a shirt, was considered oppressive. But it was then replaced with something that was, in my opinion, a lot more oppressive, which was this feeling that you yourself could never judge anybody. And it actually led to a lot of people to get off with bad behavior because we had to excuse them for just being different.
But it sounds like they were less different than conforming in a different way. I mean, I get going back to what you said at the beginning, different in that different from these alleged societal norms that were
Yes.
supposedly existing outside the school. But was there a point during your high school education where you started to realize that it was important to be different? Like, in other words, by their definition of different, there was a currency associated with that?
I don't necessarily remember a specific moment, but the more I followed along, the more I saw what was being valued and what wasn't. We were taught, for instance, in English class that we had to read stories from minority voices as if that would suddenly just make the writing better. And then instead of reading classics like To Kill a Mockingbird, we were asked to read any book, regardless of quality, genre, age range, that was written by a person of color. And that stuck with me as someone who wanted to become an author, because I thought, as a cis, straight, white person, my voice is not valued. It's something that's taking up space on the shelf instead of the one that people want to put on the shelf.
Was that explicitly communicated to you? That that's what cis, white, straight female voices were?
It was not, but it was very clearly communicated how we needed to represent more from diverse groups, but so much so that it felt like old voices of groups that weren't under that umbrella were considered old school, and we've already heard that already. And so the implication was pretty clear, but they didn't want to say it. I'm sure, I have a feeling that a lot of them weren't necessarily thinking it, but subconsciously, that's just the way that our minds had all started to work.
How did it feel leaving school just for the day? So not, when it was over and you graduated, but when you would go out into the world, was there any kind of dissonance between what you were hearing and experiencing inside the school when you would go out into the world and encounter people? Like in real life, so to speak?
I definitely remember feeling like, wait, that's not what I'm seeing in this world. And then looking really hard to try and find the oppression that I was taught about. And then I would do things like check to see how many white people versus black people were working at the store or something. But I just felt so like there must have been something wrong with me, because I just wasn't seeing what everyone else seemed to be so clearly seeing. And I also, the eggshell walking continued. When I was younger, if I walked past someone in a store, I just walked past someone in the store. It didn't matter who they were, what they looked like, but I became so paranoid about walking past somebody wrong in a way that would be perceived as something like racist, that I would actually freeze up, and you could probably see how awkward I was just walking past another person in the aisles. And I'm sure that made them more uncomfortable than had I just subconsciously maybe stuck to the side of the aisle a little bit. And in my head, I was thinking, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But all I ever ended up doing was being more and more socially anxious around people that were different from me.
Did you have any conversations with others in your peer group during this time to check if anyone felt similarly, or did you feel isolated about it?
I felt too scared to bring it up, because if you say something offensive, well, then you've just ruined that friendship.
So the friendship itself becomes almost a minefield. It's not, I mean, depending how you define friendship, when I think of my very best friends, that's how I know they're my very best friends, that I could put my foot in it and they're still gonna love me.
Yeah.
They might be like, "No, you idiot," or whatever. They might sort of chide me or tease me or gently correct me if I've said something wrong. But um, the idea that I would offend them by making an observation or paying them a compliment or something is so completely foreign. That's how I know they're a friend. Uh, did you feel like that was a kind of relationship you could even establish?
Oh, Not at all. I felt like those relationships were framed as toxic. Any banter or teasing like that was called toxic masculinity because it was usually the boys who hadn't gotten caught up in this all yet that would still have friendships like that, or, you know, bullying and things like that, even though it wasn't really bullying, it was just in friend teasing. And that was also always confusing for me and made me feel weird because I'm a girl and I want that. It's not something that's making boys be mean people. It's just that not everyone is always perfectly nice, and friends tease each other sometimes.
Right. So that's interesting. So you observed that the boys in your classes didn't seem to be as uh, hesitant or awkward as the girls. Did you observe that?
Yes.
Do you have any theories about that? Do you have any thoughts or ideas about why that might be?
I believe it mostly, my best guess is that they had uh, better relationships with their family at home. And so when they started at the school, they could come home and talk about it and write it off as, oh, that's ridiculous. I was never really close with either of my parents. Uh,
Okay.
and so I didn't have that. And I do remember one student, a boy, whose older sister had gone to the school, and she was very much into this social justice stuff. And when he started, he was your typical high school boy, you know, reckless, sometimes would say some ignorant or even genuinely offensive things. And his senior year there, he was not only a really huge proponent of it, almost as if he had to speak up to make up for feeling guilty, but I was next to him in a class once and he was just shaking. His whole demeanor had completely changed. And I think that if I had to speculate, it could be a temperamental thing, it could be family pressures. But most likely it's a combination of what other relationships from people from different perspectives are they exposed to, and also temperament as individuals. Like we said earlier, everyone will respond to this differently.
That's correct. That is true. But that's an interesting point because you identify yourself as somebody who wasn't particularly close with either of your parents, and yet something inside of you still felt like there was a mismatch. In other words, in your particular psychological makeup, you didn't do what he did. In other words, you didn't just embrace it like a convert
Mm,
and become a zealot. There was that tension that existed, and it seems to me like that tension won out, meaning that it was sufficiently uh loud in your mind to cause you to continue to ask questions, to get to, even though it misattributed the discomfort to something being wrong with you at first.
mm,
Whatever was inside of you didn't give up. In other words, you didn't settle on that. You didn't say like, "Well, there, that's what it is. I'm broken." No,
mm.
it feels to me like you kept going to the point where here you are now having this conversation with us. Um, and so do you think that's, just your unique personality? Did you have any mentors or voices in your life that helped contribute to that?
I mainly never gave in because I could never push myself hard enough to start genuinely believing it. And I think outwardly, if you had seen me in my senior year of high school, I would have looked just like that boy I was sitting next to, where I was preaching everything because I had to, but I would have looked shaky and depressed. I eventually realized the mental health diagnosis I'd been given as an elementary schooler was false. And that was something that had always caused even a lot more tension than just conforming to these ideologies. And that felt so wrong. It almost felt like I was wearing a shirt that I hurt to wear. And breaking up out of that, despite everyone in my environment at the time not objecting to it, and finding mentors that went against that mental health culture led me into opening up about the political and ideological tensions that I've experienced at my school. And eventually I also began to slowly unravel those. And I think that's what gave me my kick into rebellion, if so to speak.
Now, if it's okay, I would love it for you to explain, you can just summarize it, what it does to a child to get a diagnosis at all. And what, you obviously thought it or didn't have any reason to believe it was false at the time, but then you over time realized like it felt like that uncomfortable shirt, that just was
Mm.
painful to wear. What what would you like to say to parents out there who are facing or kids for that matter, or facing down a mental health culture now being put into the schools at younger and younger ages where they're now going to screen 100% of the students for mental health problems starting in kindergarten. They're going to start in kindergarten screening every kid. What potential harm comes if they misdiagnose a kid, in your opinion, having been through it?
I think it's really important to remember that diagnoses are not benign and they don't mean, oh, he's just different. I was misdiagnosed with autism and I was around people who truly were very far on the spectrum, and I was just a little bit socially awkward. But the friends I'd made had some pretty visibly clear challenges. And it caused my self-esteem to drop because I started believing that I also couldn't function. It isolates kids from opportunities they might need. They won't get the same enriching curriculum. And while my friends needed to be around people like them, I needed to talk to more extroverted people. Training people to believe that they're incapable will usually backfire if you're helping issues that don't exist. And there's also the risk of people being put on medications that they don't need, and the health effects of that. Usually, sometimes doctors will even ignore harmful side effects that are clearly happening to a child because they believe anxiety is the most important thing to fix. I was on meds I didn't need for 7 years and I still feel foggy. And you also just start to see yourself as a science book. I can't tell people I'm sad anymore and just think it's an everyday bad day because my mind immediately goes, this is depression, which also does a disservice to people who are genuinely depressed because the efforts to normalize it start making it seem like their very real and meaningful struggle is just whatever.
Exactly. Exactly. There's also not really a focus on getting well. Some situations of depression can be chronic, and we know that, but it's also fairly rare in the sense that, we were talking about chemical imbalances and so on. But for, I would say, the vast majority of people, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, depression is something you would want to treat with the goal of getting well, of not
Mm-hmm.
being depressed, depending again on the kind of depression you're suffering. Even people who have post-traumatic stress disorder can be treated and get through it and not suffer post-traumatic stress disorder anymore. It's not a lifelong thing like, being diabetic, type 1, let's say. So that that seems like a really hard thing to have borne through, elementary school, middle school, and then going into high school, um, on top of the other stuff. Did at any point in time when you were in high school, were you treated like well, when did you realize it was a false diagnosis? Was it before high school or during?
During high school, I started to see how little I clicked with it. And it was between junior and senior year that I officially confirmed that it was not accurate.
Now, were you what emotions did you feel when you realized that, in light of all the other things going on and the pressures to be different, to
I,
fit and be different?
I think, not fitting in with this difference is what really led me to realize that I didn't belong with this diagnosis, that it didn't describe me, because I would have friends like laugh about the panic attacks that they'd had, and that was just our everyday conversation. And I never dealt with those struggles. And so I felt very scared once I confirmed the diagnosis was false. There was a lot of therapy that was just built into our school program, like being asked to meet with a social worker at least once a month. And it was like a layer of that where I was just going through the motions just suddenly clicked off, and all of the trauma afterwards hit me. But I still had another year at that high school left. And so I was terrified to be around the system where I was pushed into treatments I didn't need. But especially because of the ideologies pushing, like, you can't deny mental health stuff. That just makes you a judgmental, ableist person for saying that you don't have it. There were
So there was
moments,
pressure to keep it.
yes, there was pressure to keep it. And like, even if people acknowledged I didn't have the symptoms, they said I needed to keep it so I could prove the stigma wrong about it being as severe as it was, which for me felt like lying for the sake of virtual signaling about my own health.
So you needed to keep the label. Uh, Did you feel like you were being told you had an obligation to other people who were really suffering to represent?
I suppose in a way, yes, or at least that I think some people also came from the perspective of the thinking I was insecure with myself, and that I felt just that people would judge me if they knew that I was autistic or something like that. But I don't have any reason to tell someone, and I was being praised that it was beautiful to be any kind of neurodivergent. So that really doesn't make sense. And yes, people would judge me. They would assume the struggles that that label implies, which is, of course, different for every person, but there's still something there. It's not meaningless. And then assume that I need help with things that I do not need help with because I am neurotypical.
I it's I find, Margo, that I have so many thoughts rattling in my brain. There's so many things that most of them are in a kind of rage bubble. Like, I have this
Yeah.
feeling inside of me that I just don't wanna, like, march down there and, like, did you feel anger? Did you feel anything like, "I need to correct this for others?" Like, that not that you had an obligation to, but did you feel like you wanted to tell anyone off or call them out, that what they were doing? The
I did.
adults, I mean.
Yeah. I did feel furious. I still feel angry, but my trauma was not in the popular narratives where you were allowed to uh, feel traumatized. So I was never given the right to start protests whenever I wanted or be as angry as I wanted. And sometimes I did lose my temper, but for the most part, I said, well, around a lot of people, I'm just going to have to politely keep it to myself and get by. And I'm actually really grateful for that because I ended up a lot stronger and a lot healthier as a result.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. I'm currently reading The Coddling of the American Mind, and one of the points they make in the book is that we've sort of inverted the message, "That which does not kill me makes me stronger," to "That which doesn't kill me makes me weaker." And you are living proof that because there was a norm to not vent your spleen all over the place, which used to be for everyone, right? It used to be pretty much expected that regardless of what was going on, even if you had a legitimate gripe, that didn't entitle you to kind of let loose and have a protest and whenever and wherever you wanted to. Um, that that you finding ways to cope or adjust or find the appropriate ways. You were writing, now you're writing and you're writing articles. This is a great coping skill, right? That made you stronger. So that's living proof that it does work, that, having some kind of social norm that says there's a time and a place to do this has a a positive effect on the people who want to do things. Provided there is that time and place. It's not just shut up forever, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So then the next thing I want to ask is, I've asked you if you, felt anger and so on, but that's towards the adults. What about your peers? What can you tell us about the peer group, beyond what you've already said? Is there anything else you'd like us to know about how much is going on peer to peer in this realm of it's important to fit in by being different?
I think the most important thing that I've witnessed that a lot of others writing about this are missing is that this is really being driven by the students. That doesn't mean that they're right, but they are the ones that hold power. I've seen teachers push against the norms, and students would get very angry with that, and it would eventually either the teacher would be forced to agree or the teacher would just end up leaving the school.
So the students have power. Do the students have adults who come in and back them up on this? Or do you have the perception that part of the reason the students have this power is that the teachers don't have backup?
I think at some point it's because they are so adamant about pushing what they want to be discussed that there's almost nothing the teacher can do about it. A lot of school culture was already really light on disciplining students because they thought that giving young adults freedom and giving teenagers freedom is what would make them happier. I mean, every teenager wants freedom. But then you would get scenarios like one of the discussion classes I took. I had a lovely English teacher. He was more progressive, but he would always keep a neutral viewpoint and have us discuss the text we were reading in English. But the students would not only talk over each other, but talk over him so much that the entire class just became an argument about mental health and gay rights. And we never finished the material.
And the teacher had no ability to rein this in, and the other students didn't say anything? Or they just went along with it?
Yeah, they went along with it, and I said something at that point because that was my internship school, and I had a bit more confidence to speak up then. And the teachers agreed with me that this was an issue, but at some point, things had gone so off the rails that they, in their power and skills as a teacher and as a human being, were just not capable of reining the kids in.
Right. So, for example, you can't envision a scenario where the teacher would say, look, we've heard from you. You've had plenty of time to speak. This class is, other people are in this class. This is not your personal time. And you are also not the teacher. So I'm going to need you to stop and let us continue with the lesson. And if you have a significant problem with that, you can step outside, because the rest of the students here are here to learn, and it is not right to dominate the conversation with your particular desired topic when we have material to cover. They are here to learn also, and you're interfering. So you can't imagine a teacher saying that.
I actually have seen this particular teacher say that when we were on hybrid remote classes, the entire Zoom room would get muted, sometimes multiple times. And as soon as the microphones went back on, the yelling just came back.
So the
And
teacher would say it and they would just ignore it.
yes, because we have to argue about, who's represented in the book and not actually the contents of the book for some reason.
Did any other students ever ask, why do we have to constantly have this argument? Or did students tell other students, cut it out?
No, it was very much, you had one group of students who was very passionate about the social justice stuff, and another group that was more immature, but would passionately argue against them. And so very few students ever wanted to learn. I mean, I don't know many students who enjoy doing homework, but they've been supported in going against discipline and in throwing away academics that was seen as elitist, and just to take your academics seriously was seen as inherently elitist. And then the quieter students like me either wouldn't say anything or would know that the staff was trying earnestly and honestly everything that they could. But I think they were so exhausted at that point, I can't even blame them.
Right. Who were the favorite teachers? Were, you know, these social justice warrior kids would love the teachers, thought the teachers were great?
They would love the teachers that went along with their viewpoints. And if a teacher dissented, I know of one of my history teachers in high school once said, one time, I will play devil's advocate, and talked about both sides of the abortion issue. And as soon as he left the room, one of the students was like, he shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. That was offensive if someone in classes had an abortion, just for the idea that he brought up the pro-life perspective. And I think it is really narrow-minded to assume that anyone who isn't adamantly pro-choice is inherently a monster, or to write off a teacher for trying to uplift multiple viewpoints. But that's just how it was.
Well, and to hold an individual accountable to be sensitive to every possible individual viewpoint as opposed to
Oh, yes.
pursuit of the truth, right? So we each of us, 300 million people, 300 million different viewpoints potentially on all these complex issues. But at some point, you have to either distill it down to, like, the pro and the con, or the list of pros and cons, or in some cases, there are objective truths and then there are falsehoods. And um, did you get the impression that pursuit of anything resembling objective truth was on the agenda at school ever?
I felt that the objective truth that they were pushing was their views and what they believed was right. But something like any set of rules that was not newly invented, like even in math classes, one of my last math teachers was saying that she would actually talk to the kids about why they would think that 2 plus 2 equals 5 to try and understand them instead of simply correcting them, which started to really worry me. There was never any sense of standards. I mean, we were graded, but the level of grading we got was very minimal. And things like the most shining example of this was me getting a really high score on one of the SAT type of tests. And when I was handed the results back by my college counselor, the way she presented them to me is, they're just completely stuck up and snooty people for thinking that you doing good on this test means that you are also smart. And this score doesn't actually matter. And by the way, please don't tell your friends that you did well.
How did that make you feel?
Pretty terrible. Pretty
So no,
terrible.
no pride from the teacher saying, "I'm proud of you, great job," or, "You can be proud of yourself here. This is," not that you need her permission, but what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
like, "Good work. You did well. Pat yourself on the back. That's quite an achievement." Nothing.
nothing, but I know what would have gotten me pride and achievement was pride and the rainbows and the pride parades. When I was younger, I would go along with what everyone was doing as a kid would. And I started thinking, well, what if I'm bisexual or something? And I didn't want to say anything about that, even if I was, when I knew that I would be celebrated as if I had somehow accomplished something for what is not even that big of an aspect of someone's personality.
Right.
And for being a woman too, that was a superpower. I was strong, I was tough, I was resilient. I don't know how that works, but I am inherently better than men, apparently. And knowing that, I think, rubs salt in the wound pretty bad.
That specific message, I am better than men apparently because I am a woman or I'm female. How did that encourage you to think about men and boys? I mean, or what did you get? What impression did you get in terms of what you were supposed to think about men and boys in general?
Uh, if they didn't act outside of the norms of masculinity, they were toxic. And I have examples. Clearly, we would watch documentaries talking about gender. They asked 9-year-olds what they would change about the world. A girl said she would make sure no one was lonely. And a boy said, I would add an extra traffic lane so we would have less traffic. And he was scorned as this, privileged, lives in a bubble, has no idea what real suffering was like, for being 9 and thinking of something a 9-year-old would say to that question. If anything, the girl that said what she wanted to say just has a very kind temperament and is very smart. Like, I was a lonely 9-year-old, I would have said that, but that's not how we were taught. And a lot of times, since the only time a man would be accepted is if he had some other sort of minority, it felt, and I hate to say this because I don't think this is actually what people are thinking about, but it felt, especially among the girls, because they were so set on their way being better and anything masculine being wrong, that they only would accept boys if they acted like girls.
Wow. That's got to be painful for a lot of the boys.
Mm-hmm.
It might not be as painful for those, as you pointed out earlier, who are very comfortable in their masculinity, or they have a great home life and they've got, maybe they're very close with their dad or something, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe they can brush it off. But the example of the boy you gave where maybe that wasn't the case and his sister already had become quite possibly even a bully at home with the social justice stuff, it's probably very challenging to be comfortable in yourself
Mm-hmm.
when there's that much pressure. You, as a female, felt like maybe something is broken in me that I don't feel oppressed. Can you
And I,
imagine?
yeah, and I felt really bad for the boys in my grade, in my school, because we didn't have. There was one art club for lunch that lasted about a year, and then after that, it was all race and gender groups, and then the women's only art club. And it felt like the reason they did that, they said to keep women safe, but there was nothing for boys to meet up and socialize. And I think a lot of people held the assumption is, well, they're men, so it's already easy for them. We were also really taught to fear men, as if like tapping someone on the shoulder was seen in the same degree of harassment as any other sort of sexual harassment if in the book. Like, everything was treated on the same level, which is really confusing and really a very scary message to teach people. And if a man would ask a question like, what if asking every 10 seconds if it's okay for us to keep hugging would just ruin how hugging in the moment feels, he would be looked at like he's some kind of pervert for asking that very normal question. And I remember the years that I was there, anytime I would be either like alone in an office with a male teacher or walking through a store around men, there was an instinct in the back of my head, what if someone does something to me? And well, sure enough, they never did. I do, obviously consent is important where it counts. And there are scenarios that do happen where men have actually done abusive things. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but the level we were indoctrinated made us walking around on edge in a way that didn't reflect the reality of how likely it is to happen. I hope that doesn't sound insensitive. It's still a tricky thing for me to talk about just right.
No, I mean, it doesn't at all, and the fact that you just even felt the need to say that, I hope it doesn't sound insensitive, to me is still, like, residual
Mhm.
leftover of how deeply ingrained this got that you have to preface and couch and wrap things up in protective language so the listener won't have a reaction, as if you are responsible for other people's reactions to what you say. There is a giant, in my opinion, gray area between rudeness, what we would all consider to be, ad hominem attack or just indecent kind of speech, and I'm just speaking and saying what's on my mind, and somebody out there has a negative reaction to it. Did you at any point ha get any lessons or any indication in any of your courses that you were not personally responsible for other people's reactions to life?
No, we were taught the opposite, that we had to be very wary of if we said something offensive. I don't think they literally told us, this is the worst thing in the world will end. Nobody talks like that, but you would feel as though it was. Um, and the way that culture would bleed into friend groups or online groups is uh, you would start having groups that would censor almost anything that was somebody's trigger, whether that was serious blood and gore or socks. There's just an idea that we have to protect everyone's mental health and everyone's individual phobias. And if you don't bend over backwards and do that, then you're being a stuffy jerk who doesn't take it seriously.
Right.
And so in leaving schools like that, but still wanting to run groups and lead groups, it has really messed up my moderation, because I feel like if I tell somebody no, then they're going to have a crisis and it is going to be my fault.
Wow. That's heavy. That's really heavy. It also runs counter to everything I've ever learned personally about even therapeutic culture. So, in other words, even if you go see a licensed therapist, it used to be anyway, that one of the things you'd be told is you are not responsible for other people's reactions to you. Now, that doesn't mean everything you've done is great. It just means that you start there. How people react to you is their choice. Like they've chosen. In fact, I was brought up explicitly taught that it's the only thing that you have control over in life is your reaction to stimuli, other people's behavior, et cetera, and so forth. It's the only thing. It's how people survive prison camp, for example, that they somehow have a way of reacting to it or dealing with it that keeps them alive versus drives them to despair and death.
Mm.
And, because they can't control being there and they can't control all the other things, so they can control their thoughts. Even in George Orwell, he talks about the little few square inches inside your mind that belong to you in spite of Big Brother. And it sounds like you never got that message.
No. I think where that comes from, was a very well-intentioned place. Most of the people I knew, they were trying their best to be kind, but their efforts failed, I think, because they assumed that their good intentions automatically excused them. But they had been sick of people who would say, well, it's your choice to react that way. Therefore, I don't have to take responsibility. Therefore, it isn't a bad thing that I've done something to hurt you. That's just all on you to deal with, which there is some gray area there that you are responsible for your own reactions. But if someone is walking around punching people in the face,
well, that's different. That's aggression. That's
yeah,
aggression. I'm talking about just the
yeah,
reactions to other people's opinions, let's say,
yeah,
or I'm not talking about, yes, if somebody
yeah,
strikes you, you have a right to self-defense. And, while you're responsible for that, you're not as responsible as if they never hit you. Okay.
yeah,
So no, that's not
absolutely.
what I meant by responsible. I meant more like other people's feelings. So other people's feelings about things. And you're correct that it could be misinterpreted to say, I get to be as nasty as I want to you and say whatever I want to you. And that's on you.
And that,
That's your
yeah,
problem.
that's kind
That
of,
doesn't
they didn't
excuse
have
it.
the gray area. And so it was very black and white. And I think people were afraid to say something like that because it would start excusing things that were obvious aggression. Like, of course, that's an entirely different scenario,
Right.
but it felt like, it was either all or nothing. Either you're vulnerable about all your feelings all the time or you're bottling them up. There's no, well, what if I just don't want to talk about them right now?
Interesting. And likewise, you sort of have two separate things going on. You have the look, we should be polite to each other and respectful to each other because that also that is it's not just good for, society or whatever. That's good for you.
Mm-hmm.
That's a
Mm-hmm.
rational thing to do. People will
Yes.
respond to you better, especially because you cannot control their reactions. You probably want to not be, offensive and, think about
Mm-hmm.
what you're going to say and put yourself in other people's shoes. These are all decent messages, the golden rule and so on. But the corollary is because ultimately even those rules don't work 100% of the time. In other words, even the rules of politeness and manners and what is decorum aren't going to work with every person all the time. Someone is going to be mean. Somebody's going to not care about those rules. We had those rules so that most people, most of the time, it's just that when they don't, what I was taught is you can't let that destroy you. Like you can't take that outlier because it used to be an outlier and let the outlier define your view
Mm-hmm.
of other people, your view of life, your view of yourself. That ultimately is within your control. That's what I meant. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is we have an overreaction so that
Mm-hmm.
perhaps some people who genuinely felt hurt by some very real things that happened to them are sort of overcorrecting and saying, no one can ever do anything that might hurt, like precog, that might hurt me, or else, to your point, I'll fall apart.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's very rush to utopia kind of thinking. And it's weird too, because you have never offend anyone else, but also be true to yourself. And when you think about that, the things where you're allowed to condemn someone and the things that they aren't supposed to be true to, the message they're really and do end up saying is be the person we want you to be. And you walk around like you're all just reciting and never expressing anything deeper than the surface because you can't and you're not allowed to unless you really, really filter it to be absolutely certain that you don't say something small that's off. Like if I say salesman instead of salesperson, I can't say that that's gender norms. And because of that, you never actually grew close to people, but you felt close to people because the norm was to talk about deep emotional issues like anxiety and insecurity. But it became in a way that felt really shallow and almost sensationalized.
Interesting. So Did you feel like this this oversharing kind of thing, for lack of a better term, interfered with your inner life? In other words, how free did you feel to just go inside your head and think your own thoughts and just have your own experience away from the prying eyes of all these, people demanding things from you? Was it completely dominated by what they were expecting at all times, or did you have a separate inner existence?
Well, of course, I had my true self inside, but I would always keep it very tight and guard it and judge myself for it. And when I was around others, I felt as though they were always trying to like tear me open. Like, if you think about the iconic scene you will see sometimes in shows and movies where someone rips off their school uniform and there's a big fancy tie-dye neon shirt underneath. They were trying to find that, and I just wanted to be in the school uniform because I actually did care about my academics. And it also has affected me in the sense that what would feel really vulnerable to share to someone else normally feels completely normal for me to say. And so I come off as really open or really awkward because I'm not as great at seeing what the more reasonable norm for that should be. I don't feel it so much as I did back then, but when I was there, I also remember feeling really pressured that I had to be announcing any kind of mental health struggles very publicly in class on social media. Kids would talk about their medication lists in class. And I, again, felt like there was something wrong with me for not wanting to do that.
Did you ever come under direct pressure within a class where you begged off and didn't say anything and were pressured by the teacher, or pressured to where you didn't feel like you could keep it to yourself?
Not by the teachers. Thankfully, that never became so unreasonable that I was like put on the spot and tell us your problems now. Nobody has said that. Among
Right.
friends, though, I felt this sense that I would either be looked at as shallow, or when I would tell people I'm not really comfortable bringing that stuff up, they would start worrying about me. And they would think that they were really close because they had a tendency to do, to them, it wasn't oversharing. It was just being open. But to me, it was oversharing. And so people would assume that we were close when I was really just trying not to tell them, screw you, when they had just told me something about the worst day of their life, even though I probably, unfortunately, did not actually care that much.
Interesting. Were there times when they would tell you these stories and you actually felt like they were being a little histrionic? Like, this is the worst day of my life, and you were thinking to yourself, really? Or did you agree with them that that sounded like a really terrible situation?
A lot of times, most of the people I knew would be very reactive, but I was also in the school I was at because of the mental health diagnoses I received. So I always felt more that these were kids with big emotional regulation issues, not necessarily due to the culture. It did feel that a lot of times it was so normalized that I had a Dungeons and Dragons thing, and sometimes in our group chats you would get people saying something that was so serious you would have to tell an adult and possibly call for help. And every time I would casually show one of my parents and be like, they said this again, because it was just every week, they were just instinctively inclined to vent to the extreme. And never, I think there was a lack of understanding in the culture that sadness, depression, and then so seriously ill and suffering that it gets to the point of being suicidal are all very different levels, and there is a very wide scale. because you would have people saying things that you know they didn't mean on any given day because they were upset about the math test.
Right. And so it's in this environment of a school for special needs. I mean, children with special emotional needs and also probably intellectual needs, if you're talking about ASD. Um, it was into that environment that they were introducing these social justice concepts? Like, on top of that? Or am I misinterpreting when and where?
Yes, I think it really started, I would see it in independent schools like this.
I
My
see. Okay.
school was technically not a special education school,
Got
but
you. Okay.
their academics were so clearly built to accommodate people who could not learn, even to the point where it was probably too easy for most of the students there, but they were just not disciplined for so long. It felt difficult to them. So it was a very poorly disguised special education program.
That's fascinating. So it's not specifically a special needs school, not specifically designed for kids with ASD or anything like that, but treating everyone as though, well, we might as well treat them like they all
Yeah.
have issues and keep things, the academics light and
Because
we're
God forbid they start to feel like they're different and we aren't just actually better than the public school, as in
I see.
different in the actual sense of the word, that they're not like people and not the way it's become popularized now.
Right. So different from these imaginary norms that are out there supposedly oppressing everyone.
Yes.
Like, I hear this too, but, it is a oppressive norm to have, worship the written word and expect good grades and expect discipline. I'm like, where's that been? I haven't seen that for going on 20 years. So, I mean, in other words, even if there had, and I'm Gen X, and yes, we had discipline, and yes, we had expectations for academic excellence, but I would never in a million years call it oppressive. It
Mm.
felt pretty normal. It was like, well, what else would we do? Why are we bothering to go to school if we're not expected to learn things? And yet I'm hearing people describe school out in this imaginary like land other than this school. All the other schools that you're not in right now to compare to are bad. And yet I haven't come across one. Except possibly the classical school private schools or some of the parochial schools where nobody's complaining. In other words, the kids who are there are like think like what I thought growing up, like, this is fine. What's the problem?
Some
So,
people can want to be in a very rigorous place like that.
but that's not
Yeah.
that's never really allowed where you were, the
Right.
suggestion that, hey, what if I want hard work and discipline and I want to wear my uniform and I don't want to share my every thought and feeling with all of you all the time? What if I want that? What if that is my authentic self? You didn't feel like that was welcome.
That wasn't even seen as a possibility. Uh, there was,
How many kids
yeah.
do you think, again, calls for speculation, but would you guess what percentage of students in your generation are more like you than not like you? Meaning more feeling like, I don't this doesn't really resonate, but okay, I'll go along with it, or for any number of reasons, versus all in. Like, I'm into this. How would you just if you had to quantify it? And again, this is a guess, folks. We don't know, but I'm just sort of curious your perception.
I would uh, estimate from what I've seen, and I can't confirm how people are thinking.
Sure.
I feel like there are a lot more people who are ambivalent but going along to be accepted than we realize, but I still think that that's more of the minority, and even those of us who are actually really struggling as opposed to just fine with it because we have to be, are within the margins. It's become the widely accepted trend now, and I don't think it's necessarily bad for anyone to be a part of it. I think I really want to share my story just to show that there isn't one way of finding yourself, and for
Right.
those like me who need it. But if you think
Right.
back in the older times where things were very rigid and there wasn't really anyone who dyed their hair, for instance, someone who did want to be all colorful and outside the box would probably feel like an outsider and want to meet other outsiders. But it would be wrong to say that the entire system was abusive and there is a major societal crisis. I don't think we are at that point yet, but I do think that we need to see multiple narratives so that kids can decide for themselves, and the ambivalent few, or even those who are all in, just know that not everybody is just like them.
Right. I mean, I would probably take a stronger position in the sense that, at least in the public system, and in a private system, people sign up for that voluntarily. But in a public system where the kids are sort of compelled to be there and compelled to learn what they're learning, and it's decided by, the state, I would say it's wrong,
Mm,
because you have to assume in a public situation that you have diversity, right? Of
mm,
viewpoints and backgrounds. And so to take such a strong position in one direction versus another, it would be just morally, ethically, functionally, everything wrong. Um, it would be as wrong as what they're accusing people of doing in this imaginary normed world
mm,
that actually wasn't so imaginary maybe decades and decades ago. But now, it's almost like they've erased any progress.
mm,
Do you get that impression that what
mm.
they're describing feels almost like pre 20th century
I
in a weird way?
I really do. It feels like it's become so extreme that it's set the rest of the world with expectations that they've made zero progress. You get things like if you're not interested in dating and romance, you're pushed to identify as an asexual because you're outside of the nuclear family norm and therefore you are so different. When beforehand you would just look like someone who had a personality and was making a personal choice, and maybe some people might think it's a little weird, but some people wouldn't. And I'm wondering, like, the more we highlight everything that is somewhat considered different from what we are telling people is society's norms, the more we perpetually send the message that people who are not oppressed are being oppressed and are victims. And that will either continually make people feel like they're stuck in the outsider spot or just cause a lot of fear in people that isn't really necessary.
Well, it's establishing a new set of norms too, isn't it?
Mm,
And fairly restrictive ones. So we've already seen, or at least I've seen on social media, people refer to people as being politically black, for example, or traitors to race traitors, or
mm,
it's like you have to be you have to fit a narrow description of your identity set as prescribed by
mm,
others, not you, as prescribed by others, or else they'll still make you have internalized racism, you have internalized misogyny,
mm.
so whatever your so-called authentic self is, it still has to fit within that's not allowed. I mean, we're getting down to the, "Oh, you want to get married, have children, stay home, raise them yourself. What's wrong with you? You like men and you're female and you don't think they're all rapists. What's wrong with you?" Um, as opposed to, "Okay, so you're comfortable with the traditional norms as they are or whatever, and that's your choice, and cool. Choice. Yay." Uh, there's no room for that, right? And what you're describing, it sounds like that's just someone who hasn't woken up.
Yes, that is exactly how they see it. I think what you said, you see me nodding along, that's pretty much everything that I've internalized. I wouldn't say, you hear people say, well, nobody's saying that. Nobody's saying that directly. We have to semantically say things for the sake of conversation that isn't being polished by several top tier editors before we publish it. But it's right on the nose of everything that is still going around in my head.
Now, you've given us a couple of examples from your classes. Perhaps you can give us one that helps explain that, how they don't directly communicate this way of being is bad, but through the selection of material, the presentation of material, even let's say a novel or a film or some kind of discussion, it you get the message just the same. You get the message that this represents something you shouldn't want or you shouldn't be or you shouldn't do.
Yes. So one of the conversations that would come up in the English discussion class was kids pushing against the nuclear family norm. And the way they would say it is, we need to stop making this seen as a standard and represent more variety. So that doesn't inherently feel like an attack, although it does feel, with how passionate they are, that they are tearing it down. But when a male student says, I don't feel uncomfortable with that, they push back at him, well, you're just very lucky. You're just privileged. You just don't realize how it's affecting you. Or other times you're told you can't say anything offensive. You have to be an agent of change. You're shown all of the horrible things going on in the world, and if you don't do something about it, well, gosh, you wouldn't want to just let this go. And then when you're told something like, we need to represent more diversity, and only shown a bigger number of materials with leads from minority groups as the main characters, then you get the impression of, well, look who's getting taken off the shelf. And sometimes it is more blunt, but you're also going along with it, feel so much, well, they're just in the state of trauma, and I'm the majority, so I guess I can't blame them because of how strong that victim narrative is, that they'll say systemic racism, all white people are racist. But, it's not personally directed at you, and we're not saying that we want to, kill all white people. We're just saying that they're all racist because they are. So, and because people are doing such kind things, there are needs to stand up against racism and sexism and all the isms that are still legitimate. It feels like you can't question them because they frame themselves as the only resistance. And if you're under such an oppressive society, why would you tear them down if all that does is lead the bad guys that are supposedly out there back in? And so you start to also see the way they see themselves as, these people, they can't possibly be mean because all they're doing is standing up for themselves.
Right. Now, I want to start to wrap up because you've given us so much of your time. But I do want to ask you some specific questions about actions that concerned adults have been taking or are thinking of taking. And I want to get your, sort of rapid fire take on good idea, neutral, bad idea, and then follow that with any suggestions you have on what your peers can do or should do if you think you have some thoughts for them, as well as what parents can do. So first, book challenges. When parents go to school boards and say, you got to get these books out of the library, they're too focused in LGBTQ, or they're violent, they're graphically sexual, et cetera, and so forth. Do you think this helps or hurts your generation in terms of, is it something that people should be focusing on?
I am against book challenges. I
Okay.
feel like I feel like it just makes more tension, and it's not the focus of the problem.
Okay.
And a library book is not what's indoctrinating people. It's the culture of the teachers in the classroom, and fighting things like that is just going to serve more tension and make people see more reason to be afraid. What I would instead do is push back directly on something deeper, like, why are you teaching something that is this focused on these ideas in a classroom and not something else? Or even just trying to make whatever choices you can at home with uh, what is being read or taught.
Right. Right. So to that point, I mean, one of the arguments I've made is that people need to understand the reason the books are being put in the library,
Mm,
which is to generate the generative
mm,
Paulo Freirean kind of idea, to generate themes and to generate questions that then those teachers that you bring up can say, well, the students are asking the questions. The students want to know, well, why do you want to talk about it so much with the students? Right? Why is that the focus, to your point? But simply sitting on the shelf, the book is sitting on the shelf. And it would be almost contradictory to say that book sitting on the shelf presents a threat when you're telling other people that a book by a dead white man sitting on the shelf doesn't present a threat. So
mhm.
you're almost validating the idea of a book presenting a threat, which is their argument, not the rational person's argument, isn't it? So, I mean, as a parent, I'm torn because I think some of the books really are age inappropriate.
Mhm.
But I'm coming around to the notion of, like what you're saying, that the spending a year going title by title by title is creating more of a problem than it is solving a
Mhm.
problem. So then the next one I would say is um, the effort to put, let's say, cameras in the classroom or recording devices or things to like monitor what the teachers are teaching, what they're doing. What's your reaction to that?
I feel like that's invasive.
Okay.
We don't, uh, I mean, general security that any place might do is a different subject. But if you're trying to spy on students and teacher privacy, like, there could be sensitive discussions in those classes or moments that people don't want getting out and getting leaked like that. But there are structures. If a school doesn't have a structure to properly hold staff accountable, or if there isn't a way to ask a parent or a counselor or someone to observe, I think that is more of an issue with the system. But that feels really creepy to me, and I've never heard of anyone doing that, and I certainly would not feel comfortable with that as a student, even if it was, no matter how desperate I would be to have some proof of the things that my teachers had said. I would rather either just call a therapist or an adult in to observe or write it down than to do something like that.
Got you. Okay. How about tech in general? So, for example, uh, when people in my generation and even some millennials were in school, we used books, like actual
Mm.
paper books, all the time, not just occasionally. And we did not have one to one computing devices to do 90% of our work. Do you feel like is, it facilitates this kind of singular viewpoint that you're using tech to do the learning, or is it neutral, or what's your take on tech in the classroom in that respect?
I feel as though a lot of schools I've been in haven't been strict enough on things like cell phone policies, or uh, even now that that's a thing, virtual attendance. They would just let anyone skip as much as they would like without a reason that would should be considered legitimate. Like, I'm anxious today. I don't feel like being there in person. We need to push kids to be around other people face to face to socialize. We needed to teach them to stay off their phone in class, which wasn't really enforced. I don't think we can stop computers if people are taking notes on a laptop versus in a notebook. it's something they're going to encounter in the future, and it's impossible to completely eradicate. But I do think it's important to sometimes put that technology aside and prioritize showing up, being in person, communicating in person, and the polite thing of not having your phone out in class.
Right.
That's not oppressive like kids say it is because they're annoyed.
Right.
But kids have done that for centuries, and most of the time when they have become adults, they've become the ones telling kids to please put their phones away because they know now why that's important.
Right. Exactly. So, having gone over some of the things that people have suggested or thought of to do, what do you think? You sort of hinted before we started talking about holding staff accountable and so on. What do you think would be better or would help for both the students in question if they feel like you do, or for parents who are concerned that their children might end up going through what you went through, or what would you suggest as somebody in your generation that we might not have thought of or tried?
I think it's really important for parents and kids to communicate and to talk to each other. Obviously, not everyone will have the same ability to choose as others, depending on a lot of factors. But there are things that you can control of whether you are picking a school that is the best fit for your child. I also think it's good for parents. If my parents had believed me more when I told them what was going on in school, they thought I was just being too sensitive or making it up. And I don't think I really articulated examples why. And I think it's important to explain to kids a variety of these perspectives, especially if they know what's being taught. Women think this. Oh, well, actually, here's examples of women in your life that feel differently. And to ask the kids how they're doing and why they think that. And having that stable relationship will at least open up that person's perspective, which means that's one more peer that's willing to either speak up or go against the grain, and then you can know what is going on. And if there is trauma happening from an environment like that, you'll be aware of it. Or if it is someone who is really taking on that stuff, it's not good to argue about the little things. But if you start talking to them, one of the things that I've seen in my family with younger relatives that were like, oh, all rich people are bad.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard
Well,
that.
actually, some rich people, I would give other examples, and eventually those statements would mellow off,
Okay.
which happens partly with maturity, but there has to be some level of discipline. However, telling them that they're just dumb and stuck up and don't know what they're doing and starting a fight over it, kids who take up the stuff feel really unsafe because they're trained to feel really unsafe.
Right.
And one of the first things that happens is we have to make them feel safe to get to what's going on deeper. And it's a lot of work, but that's really where the core of it is going to be at, because we can do our work here to try and change the schools. But I think it is more important, and especially for myself, I've seen people try to change society, but never try and be a friend to me. And it is more important to take care of your loved ones first and do what you can to make sure that at least they are okay than to try and solve society at large.
I would agree, but it's a tough message to push back on when
Mhm.
school is explicitly or implicitly pushing the obligation to the collective, an
Mhm.
obligation to others. And especially if they're making you feel so uncomfortable in your own individual self that you look to others to define who you are. You're a woman, you're a teenager, you're white, you're straight, you're what, you're all these things
Mhm.
that other people say you are, and they're not going to let you not identify as that. In other words, it's
Mhm.
not okay to just say, "Okay, that's the description the police would give if I went missing, but that's not who I am."
Mhm.
That doesn't sum me up. Those are not the most important things you need to know about me. In fact, I never think about them. And obviously you might get back, "Well, that's because you have the privilege that you don't have to think about them." That's a cop out. I get to decide who I am, not you. Like it It's
It
not about whether it's privilege or
yeah,
not. Like, you get to decide who you are. I'm not reserving the right
yeah,
to judge you or anything like that. So, but if they're getting that explicit message, I wonder how parents can do that. And I'm asking because if it only begins to show in high school, if other kids are having experience similar to yours, let's say, the parents might think everything's fine, right? Because everything really was sort of fine, maybe.
mhm,
And then it wasn't. But if the child is not forthcoming that something is amiss, the parent might be completely oblivious
mm,
that this is going on. I would
yeah,
hope that's not the case anymore. I hope there's been enough press that
yeah,
things are going on that, you know, but I still think it's challenging because parents, just like you were saying to us, like I walk on eggshells. I don't know what to say. I don't want to wreck the relationship by saying the wrong thing. Many of us are in the same position.
mm,
So, and not because of the social justice thing necessarily, but because parenting norms have changed so much that it's now abuse to raise your voice to your child. It's now considered potentially worthy of calling social services if you make a rule that somebody else finds to be too restrictive, perhaps about what your child wears or how late they could stay out at night or how much they can use their phone. And I've found a lot of parents are tied up in knots about, just like the schools don't have discipline, they're almost afraid
mm. That's
to
scary.
broach certain topics with their kids, to ask certain questions, um, for fear of completely losing their children.
Mm,
So that is something that is I've noticed amongst parents. Well, I don't want to alienate them. I don't want them to leave the house, and move in with a
mm,
friend or, God forbid, a
mm,
teacher or something, call social service and say that my parent isn't accepting of my identity, when all the parent said was, "Are you sure?
mm.
Like, when did this start?" And that could, as you've pointed out, they go to an extreme.
Yeah, that's tough.
So it's a tough situation. That's why I asked about the elementary level and the middle school level, which you didn't experience when you got the misdiagnosis, which is terrible. But I think the earlier it starts, the harder it's going to be
Mm.
for
I
these
think
parents.
the best thing to do is to take on a variety of perspectives outside of school, like whether it's just talking kids to teach them to ask questions instead of just believe one thing, or signing them
Mhm.
up for activities that have different things, or let them do something other than sitting in their identity, or just building connections. I run a online community where we discuss my art, and I have a rule that we don't get into heated subjects, because I know if we did off the bat, people would think uh, have very different impressions of each other, and sometimes there is just a need to have uh, both the social justice stuff and the counter arguments stop, and
Right.
give people some time to acclimate to each other and understand that the other person isn't a threat,
Right.
and to break out of those boxes they've been seeing themselves in, and come into an interest that is usually bigger and a lot more fulfilling of a connection than what would have been taught in a space like my school. And then once that subject gets brought up, it's not an immediate scenario to put someone on the defensive because they have some basis of connection to know, okay, this is the guy I play board games with every week. If
Right.
he asks me something like that, he doesn't want me dead.
Yeah. That's probably the case. Um, and I like that idea of, find more things for them to do. It does put a little more work on the parents, but I think what you're highlighting is the risk associated with relying on the school as the community.
Mm-hmm.
So if school is going to define all the people with whom your child interacts, you best be very comfortable with all those people, right? And the ideas that they put forth and the activities they have your child engaged in. And
Mhm.
if you're not, then you have to use that system, let's say, then that much more work you're gonna have to take on that much more to find other outlets outside of that community to give the child different perspectives, different opinions, exposure to thought patterns that will challenge that. And this is but that brings me to sort of my final question for you, which is, let's say we do all that. Do you think there's still do you think it's still a risk, or it's still too much potentially for some students to be forced to go through that notwithstanding? So in other words, if you'd had your choice to not be in an environment that you were in, to have been able to go to your mom or dad or whomever early on and say, "Hey, this is not working for me. I feel all kinds of weird." Let's imagine that the misdiagnosis didn't happen. So like let's just say all other things being equal, you were in that school and you said, I don't feel like any of this is right for me and I feel very strange. Would you have preferred to be able to say, "Oh, okay, so let's put you over here instead," where they don't do that? Or do you feel like if you'd had other activities to engage and that balanced it out, it would have been fine or even worthwhile to go through that?
I think, given all of the variables, including the treatment that was intertwined, if I knew someone to at least say no to things like that, and the level of education that my high school gave me really didn't sufficiently prepare me at all, it would have probably been needed, and I still feel like I am missing needed things of having been in a school of a more even at least average standard. However, emotionally speaking, I feel like it would have been tough, but I would have gotten through it the same way any awkward teenager gets through. High school is tough. It's going to be tough. And
Mhm.
the fact that it wasn't perfect, I don't want to say that people need to move the stars in the sun to have saved me. But I was really academically undertaught, and the mental health stuff I'm learning more and more is really intertwined with this culture. And so I would say there needs to be at least some level of agency to make sure that parents aren't saying yes to things like that that could have real future ramifications uh, on a child's physical health or their educational future.
So then what I hear you saying is that even if you do add in, different activities, different, you talk to your child, you have family dinner together, you do all these things, you still need to focus on reforms or changes that protect all the children from sort of intrusive
Mm.
diagnostic, uh, mental health level, screenings and treatments and so forth at the school level, that should not go on in the school. The focus should be on academics. And to the extent that parents should push for that rather than sort of against books in the library or
Yeah,
different things,
I
it
think,
would be better.
yeah, if you took away the like forced therapy, medical stuff, and we had some actually enriching and proper academic learning, the other stuff would have been it would have been fine. I mean, I'm not saying everyone would have loved it,
Right.
but who does? You're always going to have, especially with kids at that age and in a society in general, a high school where some kids don't fit in, and that's tough. That's not the stuff that's the biggest
Right.
risk factor. It's medications and diagnoses and actual preparedness for the future that can have serious consequences, which is really the core of the issue.
Right. Right. I would agree. So this has been absolutely fascinating. I mean, there's a lot that I've learned that I didn't know before, even though I've spent all my time researching this stuff. As I said at the outset, what you can't know what you don't know because you're not living it and you're not, it's not
Mhm.
your actual experience. And I also think, or rather, I hope the audience will take to heart your thoughts on the way we are trying to help our kids. Like, are we really helping, or are we accidentally, creating more stress, creating more of a problem for the kids, or perhaps even facilitating some of the damage? So, if, for example, we start looking like we're foaming at the mouth at the school board meeting over a book, does it lend legitimacy to these kids have terrible home lives and need mental health care? Or these parents are unhinged, or my concern is that it will start to appear that the focus is not on making sure these kids have access to the education they need, the academic enrichment and education they need, but that parents want the childcare they need to more closely mirror what they would do if they were doing it themselves, but they're not. Do you understand the distinction?
Mm.
It's kind of like, I've made the
Yeah.
decision to use this system, which essentially for 8 hours a day replaces me, does what I'm literally not doing. I'm not, doing the teaching, I'm not doing the taking care of and all that stuff. And so I've chosen to do that, or I'm going along with it, but I want it done exactly the way I would want it done. And it's kind of a weird
Mm.
tension, if
Yeah.
that's what you want, maybe you should do that thing.
Yeah.
But can you really have that? No, you cannot really have that. And just as I wouldn't think it's appropriate for somebody who agrees with every single narrative that you were taught to say the school should mirror my lived experience, like my narratives. I don't necessarily think it's right to say it should mirror somebody else's narratives.
Mm.
It shouldn't be anybody's narratives. It's
Right.
supposed to be an open, neutral opportunity for children to take an education, to come in and learn, as you point out, what they need to know to be individually successful in their lives. And the rest of it, culture, norms, all the things, I think that should still be up to parents, not schools. But that's me. I'm weird that way. So, anyway, thank you so much. Now tell us where people can find you, to interact with you and to see your work. I know in the show notes we have listed your articles,
Mm.
as well as that people can find you at Third Factor. What else do they need to know?
All right. Yes. So the most prominent place you can find me if you want to hear my thoughts or meet me is Third Factor magazine. I also host several groups there, including a creative writers group and a group called Maladjusted to Maladjustment, which is some more philosophical terms to say if you don't fit in with being different, just like we've talked about. Uh, Also linked, you can find my board game and my art community. That's called Cross Cards. Uh, and I'm selling those over at a site called The Game Crafter. So,
And Christmas is coming, and
yes.
Hanukkah. All the present giving holidays, I'll just be inclusive. They're coming. So if you have, is it for specifically for your age range, or would parents enjoy these as well? Like
It's
us old folks.
it's quite like Pokemon Cards or Magic the Gathering, where if you're a nerd, you can enjoy it. There's also a Redbubble merch store linked there, and we have just updated that with new designs, including holiday themed and slogans I think this audience, I hope, would like, such as, if life gives you eggshells, make them into an omelet. So I really
Oh, how
hope that
funny.
you enjoy all of that.
If life gives you eggshells. That would be a very crunchy omelet. But I think it's great. I love that you've taken this taken this on and are going at it with writing and art and entrepreneurship. I
Mm.
think that in and of itself sets an example for others in your generation. If you don't fit in with being different, then what's your final word of advice?
My final word of advice is to be you. Don't try to be any set norm or label. Just be a person. If you don't fit in with being different, don't get caught up in the trap of finding the I don't fit ins, but try and look towards what you want to do in a life where you do belong and in a life that makes you happy.
Love that. Wonderful. Well, everyone, Margo Margen, thank you so much. I cannot tell you how great this has been. It's really refreshing. So everyone, thank you for joining us, and I will be back next week with another Dissident Dispatch. In the meantime, please check out Margo's work, and we will see you next time.